Hi, my name's Raj Patel, and I'm a fellow here at the Institute for Food and Development Policy, also known as Food First.
Okay. So, Raj, you've got a bit of a history working on food, and particularly around the food crises that we've had. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, sure. I mean,
you work on land, you work on food.
Well, yeah, everything I need to know about
economics.
Everything I need to know about food I learned when I was working here at Food First, and that's what put me in good stead. I've written a couple of books about that, and essentially done work on the food system from sort of farm to fork, and we're seeing a range of sort of eruptions of protest around food right now. As we film this, for example, there are food protests happening in Mozambique, and those food protests are exactly the part of the bigger sort of tapestry of food rebellions and of protests around the increasingly unjust way in which food is produced and distributed in the world today.
And what about the response from the grassroots, both in the U.S. and around the world? We're seeing not just food rebellions of people very angry about not being able to afford food, but also organizations, unions, different social movements that are trying to respond and change things. And where's that going?
Well, I don't. You're absolutely right. We're as someone who's involved in this kind of food activism, I know a lot of my comrades and friends in the movement find themselves addressing a question over and over again, and that question is, I'm just one person, what can I do? Everyone seems to be asking that, and particularly in the US, people are like, I'm just one person, what can I do? And I buy my food from the local farmer's market, and I cook it myself, and I'm interested in labor, and I seem to be doing the right things, and isn't that pretty cool? Yes, that's great. It's important that we don't give the money to the supermarkets. It's important that when we consume mindfully. But being a consumer is not all we are. And I think that that's the first sort of moment of recognition. We need to recognize that we're not just consumers, we are citizens. But so sometimes it can be a little frustrating, because then the question becomes, well, I'm just one citizen, what can I do? And if you address the question in that way, then it seems like there's only a few things that you can really get round to. You can vote as a citizen, you can sign a petition, and that's about it as a citizen. You can just remain a kind of one among many, and that's you sort of chip in with your signature or with your X in a box, and that's about it. But that framing of just one person against the world is really very odd. Historically, in the history of social change, it's incredibly unusual to frame it as me versus the world. If you look at the history of movements and of social change, it's never really been about me versus the world. It's always been about us versus the world. And I think this sort of shift towards individualism is something that I'm seeing in a number of domains, including the food justice movement, particularly in northern, in the global north. I mean, you do see it as well in the global south, but increasingly it's in the global north about one person versus the world. And it's a very heroic narrative, but it's not a narrative that helps us make change happen. And I think that if we reduce ourselves to one versus many, although it's nice to be the hero in your own narrative, the narratives about social change that matter are ones in which we see ourselves much more as part of a group, as much more in solidarity with, much more engaged with, much more as part of a bigger movement. And without the sort of stories in which we, positioned as within a particular class or within a particular history, move together and see ourselves as part of something much bigger, without those narratives, then of course all we have is the hero, us versus the world story. And so there's only so far that you can go with an me versus the world story. There's only so far you go where one person changes the world, and that's usually a kind of Hollywood story in which all of a sudden something one person can make a difference. And so I'm seeing not a deficit of this big narrative that helps us see ourselves as part of a bigger movement, but I worry a little bit about the direction of our food justice movements. I think that there's now's the time for us to be thinking much more bigger picture. We need a much more utopian vision about how it is that the world is going to be and the world we are fighting for, in order then that we can write back the story of how we get to this utopia. And I think that sometimes we lose the utopia that we're fighting for, and instead all we allow ourselves is to dream of a world in which we do consume sustainably and ethically, and everything that we buy is produced in a way that we can have a clean conscience. That's not a utopia. That's something that a supermarket might one day provide. But that's not utopia. Utopia is something much bigger. And I think that without the sort of bigger picture narratives that have sometimes fallen out of fashion, particularly in the academy, but without these sort of big utopian visions of the future, we allow ourselves to aim much lower, to let our goals be much smaller, and to make ourselves much more atomized and individualized. And that, I think, is something that we need to change. And I think that a project that really does have that bigger picture in mind is something that we desperately need right now.